Pain caused by people often feels heavier than any other struggle. When someone you trust hurts you, it creates confusion in the heart. Many believers stay silent about this pain. They smile outwardly while breaking inwardly. God sees this hidden struggle. Emotional wounds affect how people pray, think, and make decisions. Hurt can slowly steal peace without warning. If pain is ignored, it grows deeper. God never intended his children to carry silent wounds alone. Healing does not start by pretending everything is fine. It starts by acknowledging the hurt honestly. God invites truth before transformation. He wants healing, not performance. This message exists because God cares about emotional healing. He provides wisdom for broken hearts. His way brings peace, not pressure. Healing begins when you choose God's process. God understands betrayal more than anyone else. Scripture shows how rejection and pain are part of human experience. Being hurt does not mean weak faith. It means you are human. Many people confuse pain with failure. They believe being hurt means they did something wrong. But pain often comes from loving deeply. God never blames the wounded. Hurt can change behavior if left untreated. People become guarded, cold, or distant. God wants healing before damage spreads. Emotional pain must be handled with wisdom. God's desire is restoration, not bitterness. He wants the heart whole again. When healing happens, faith becomes stronger. Pain does not get the final word. Emotional wounds often come unexpectedly. A word spoken carelessly can leave lasting damage. Silence from someone you trusted can hurt deeply. God notices every detail. Pain affects confidence and identity. People begin to question their worth. God never allows pain to define value. Your worth comes from Him alone. Unhealed hurt creates emotional fatigue. Joy feels distant. Peace becomes rare. God offers renewal for tired hearts. Healing begins with understanding God's heart. He is close to the broken. He restores what pain tried to steal. God's presence brings emotional safety. Many believers struggle with unresolved hurt. They pray but still feel heavy. This does not mean prayer failed. It means healing takes time. God works layer by layer. He heals what people cannot see. Emotional pain often hides behind strength. God sees beyond appearances. Hurt can distort perception. Small things feel overwhelming. God brings clarity through truth. His wisdom restores balance. God never rushes healing. He walks patiently with the wounded. His timing protects the heart. Healing happens when the soul feels safe. Pain from people often feels personal. It touches identity and trust. God knows how deeply it affects the soul. He never minimizes emotional wounds. Many try to heal by distraction. Others bury pain under activity. God invites healing through reflection. Silence with Him brings clarity. Ignoring pain delays freedom. God wants emotional honesty. Healing begins with openness before Him. Truth opens the door to peace. God's way leads to restoration. His wisdom protects the heart. Healing becomes possible when trust is placed in Him. This is the foundation for everything ahead. Hurt often changes how people see the world. Trust becomes fragile. Words feel heavier than before. God understands this shift inside the heart. When pain is ignored, it slowly shapes reactions. People become defensive without realizing it. God does not want pain to control behavior. He wants healing to restore balance. God teaches awareness before action. Recognizing emotional changes is part of wisdom. Healing begins when pain is acknowledged, not hidden. God meets honesty with grace. Freedom starts when the heart is understood. God brings light to emotional confusion. His truth stabilizes shaken emotions. Healing becomes possible through awareness. Some wounds come from people who meant well. Not all pain is intentional. Misunderstandings can still leave deep scars. God sees the full picture. Pain does not always come from enemies. Sometimes it comes from close relationships. God prepares the heart to handle disappointment. He offers wisdom, not resentment. Holding anger toward unintended hurt causes damage. God teaches discernment over judgment. Wisdom separates intent from impact. This protects the heart. God's guidance brings emotional clarity. He helps release unnecessary blame. Peace follows understanding. Healing grows through maturity. Emotional pain often brings isolation. People withdraw to protect themselves. Silence feels safer than vulnerability. God notices this retreat. Isolation can feel protective, but becomes harmful. Healing needs connection with God. He restores trust gently. He never forces openness. God draws the wounded heart closer, not farther away. His presence creates safety. Emotional walls slowly come down. Trust begins with Him. Healing restores connection. God replaces fear with peace. The heart opens again at the right time. Restoration happens without pressure. Pain can distort memory. Hurt moments replay endlessly. The mind becomes stuck in the past. God offers renewal. Reliving pain drains emotional energy. It steals joy from the present. God calls His people into healing, not replay. He offers peace for the mind. God renews thinking through truth. His word interrupts painful cycles. Emotional healing begins in the mind. Thoughts slowly change direction. When thoughts heal, emotions follow. God restores focus and calm. The heart learns rest again. Peace becomes consistent. Many people blame themselves for being hurt. They question their decisions. Shame quietly takes root. God never agrees with shame. Self-blame keeps wounds open. It damages confidence and faith. God corrects false beliefs with truth. He speaks restoration over guilt. God reminds the wounded of their value. Pain does not define worth. Mistakes do not cancel purpose. God restores identity. Healing deepens when truth replaces shame. God rebuilds confidence gently. The heart regains strength. Freedom begins within. Pain often makes people question their faith. They wonder why God allowed the hurt. These thoughts come quietly. God understands these inner questions. Questioning does not mean loss of faith. It means the heart is searching for meaning. God welcomes honest emotions. He does not reject wounded believers. God allows questions to lead to deeper trust. Through pain, faith matures. Shallow belief becomes rooted conviction. Healing strengthens spiritual depth. As faith grows, pain loses control. God replaces confusion with understanding. Trust slowly rebuilds. The heart becomes steadier again. Some people try to stay strong by hiding pain. They believe showing hurt means weakness. God never asks for emotional denial. He asks for truth. Hidden pain often surfaces later with greater force. God desires early healing. Suppressed emotions block peace. Honesty opens the door to freedom. God heals what is brought into the light. He works with openness. Strength comes from surrender, not pretending. Healing flows through truth. When pain is acknowledged, relief begins. God brings calm to exposed wounds. The heart breathes again. Strength becomes genuine. Hurt can make prayer feel difficult. Words feel empty. Silence replaces confidence. God understands these quiet seasons. Prayer does not require perfect words. God listens to the heart. Even silent tears speak loudly to Him. He remains present. God draws closer during emotional dryness. He strengthens faith beneath the surface. Healing happens even when feelings are absent. Over time, prayer becomes easier again. God restores connection. The heart feels heard. Peace slowly returns. Emotional pain can affect decision-making. Hurt influences choices without warning. People react from wounds, not wisdom. God desires clarity. Godly wisdom slows emotional reactions. It creates space between pain and action. Healing requires patience. God protects through restraint. When emotions settle, clarity rises. God restores sound judgment. Decisions become peaceful again. Fear loses control. Wisdom guards the future. God leads the healed heart forward. Pain no longer directs choices. Peace becomes the guide. Many people feel pressured to heal quickly. Others expect immediate forgiveness. God never rushes emotional restoration. Healing has seasons. God respects the pace of the heart. He heals gently and completely. Forced healing creates false peace. True healing takes time. God values depth over speed. He rebuilds emotional strength carefully. Every layer matters. Nothing is wasted. As healing progresses, confidence returns. God restores emotional stability. The heart becomes resilient. Peace becomes lasting. Pain often comes from those closest to the heart. Trust creates vulnerability. When that trust is broken, the wound feels deeper. God understands this kind of pain. Close relationships shape emotional security. When they cause hurt, stability is shaken. God steps in to rebuild what was damaged. He restores inner balance. God never ignores relational wounds. He sees betrayal clearly. Healing begins when pain is acknowledged without denial. God meets the broken with care. As healing progresses, trust is rebuilt wisely. God teaches discernment. The heart becomes stronger, not closed. Wisdom replaces fear. Betrayal often leaves confusion behind. Questions have no clear answers. The mind searches for understanding. God offers peace beyond explanation. Seeking answers can deepen pain. God teaches acceptance over obsession. Healing does not require full clarity. Peace comes through trust. God helps release unanswered questions. He replaces mental turmoil with calm. Emotional stability returns slowly. The heart finds rest. Healing frees the mind from endless loops. God restores mental peace. Thought patterns change. Stillness replaces chaos. Hurt can quietly change personality. Gentle people become guarded. Open hearts turn cautious. God notices this shift. Self-protection can turn into isolation. God desires protection without fear. Healing brings balance. Openness returns safely. God heals identity damaged by pain. He restores authenticity. Fear loses influence. Confidence returns naturally. As healing deepens, the true self reappears. God rebuilds joy. Emotional freedom grows. The heart becomes whole again. Unhealed pain often affects communication. Words become sharp or distant. Emotions leak unexpectedly. God offers healing for expression. God teaches gentle speech rooted in peace. Healing softens reactions. Conversations become healthier. Emotional control increases. As the heart heals, tone changes. God restores kindness. Communication reflects inner peace. Relationships improve. Healing transforms how words are used. God aligns speech with love. Emotional safety returns. Harmony grows naturally. Pain can cause spiritual confusion. People question direction and purpose. Hurt creates fog. God brings clarity. God speaks through peace, not pressure. Healing clears emotional noise. Direction becomes visible again. Faith regains confidence as wounds heal. Spiritual focus sharpens. God restores vision. Purpose becomes clear. Hope rises again. Healing reconnects the heart with calling. God realigns the soul. Confidence strengthens. Forward movement begins. Pain often creates emotional exhaustion. The heart feels tired even without physical effort. Carrying hurt quietly drains strength. God understands this invisible weight. Emotional fatigue affects motivation and joy. Simple tasks feel heavy. God does not shame tired hearts. He offers rest through healing. God restores energy by healing the source of pain. When wounds close, strength returns. Peace renews motivation. Life feels lighter again. Healing restores emotional stamina. God replaces heaviness with calm. The heart regains balance. Strength flows naturally once more. Some pain resurfaces unexpectedly. A memory, a place, or a word triggers emotion. God sees these sudden waves. He remains present. Triggers do not mean failure. They reveal areas still healing. God works patiently with layers of pain. Nothing is rushed. God teaches awareness during emotional moments. Recognizing triggers prevents reaction. Wisdom creates space for peace. Healing deepens. Over time, triggers lose power. God replaces pain with stability. Emotional responses soften. Freedom grows steadily. Hurt can create fear of closeness. The heart avoids deep connection. Self-protection feels safer. God understands this defense. Fear limits healthy relationships. God desires connection without pain. Healing restores confidence in healthy bonds. Trust returns gradually. God teaches discernment, not fear. Wisdom guides closeness. Boundaries protect peace. Love remains possible. As healing progresses, openness returns. God rebuilds relational courage. The heart learns safety again. Connection becomes healthy. Some wounds affect self-esteem. Hurtful words echo internally. Confidence weakens slowly. God hears those echoes. Negative self-talk grows from pain. God replaces lies with truth. Healing restores identity. Worth becomes clear again. God speaks value over the wounded. Pain does not define identity. Healing renews self-respect. Confidence stabilizes. As truth settles, self-image heals. God strengthens inner security. Confidence grows quietly. Peace follows. Pain can cause emotional numbness. Feelings fade to avoid hurt. The heart disconnects. God notices this silence. Numbness protects temporarily, but blocks joy. God desires full emotional life. Healing restores healthy feeling. Sensitivity returns safely. God gently awakens the heart. He restores joy without overwhelming pain. Balance returns slowly. Emotions stabilize. Healing allows feeling without fear. God brings emotional depth. Life regains color. Peace accompanies joy. Unresolved hurt often affects sleep. Thoughts replay late at night. Rest becomes difficult. God understands restless minds. Nighttime amplifies emotion. God offers peace beyond understanding. Healing calms racing thoughts. Rest becomes possible again. God brings comfort through stillness. Trust quiets the mind. Emotional peace invites rest. Sleep improves naturally. Healing restores peaceful rest. God renews strength overnight. The mind settles. Calm returns. Pain sometimes creates emotional distance from God. Prayer feels distant. Faith feels quiet. God remains near. Silence does not equal separation. God stays present in quiet seasons. Healing happens even in stillness. Trust deepens unseen. God works beneath emotions. Faith grows roots. Healing strengthens spiritual depth. Peace develops slowly. Connection returns gently. God restores intimacy. Trust feels secure again. Faith matures. Hurt can cause overthinking. The mind searches endlessly. Peace feels unreachable. God offers mental rest. Overthinking increases anxiety. God teaches surrender of thoughts. Healing brings mental clarity. Calm replaces noise. God renews the mind through truth. Peace interrupts endless loops. Focus returns gradually. Balance is restored. Healing brings mental freedom. God quiets the mind. Thoughts align with peace. Stability returns. Pain can affect how people see the future. Hope feels uncertain. Expectations shrink. God restores vision. God reminds the wounded that the future is safe. Pain does not cancel promise. Healing renews hope. Perspective shifts. God rebuilds trust in tomorrow. Fear loses authority. Confidence grows. Hope strengthens. As healing completes, vision expands. God restores expectation. Faith looks forward again. Joy returns. Some people internalize pain as identity. Hurt becomes part of self-definition. God corrects this gently. Pain is an experience, not identity. God separates wounds from worth. Healing restores truth. Identity stabilizes. God redefines the heart through love. Healing removes false labels. Confidence rebuilds slowly. Peace settles. Identity becomes secure again. God restores self-understanding. The heart feels whole. Freedom grows. Pain can cause comparison. People measure their healing against others. God discourages comparison. Healing is personal. Every heart heals differently. God honors individual journeys. Progress looks different for everyone. Peace grows uniquely. God focuses on completion, not speed. Healing unfolds at the right pace. Pressure disappears. Trust increases. Freedom comes without comparison. God restores contentment. Peace settles deeply. Confidence returns. Unhealed hurt can affect generosity. People become guarded with love. God desires openness without harm. Healing restores the ability to give wisely. God balances love with boundaries. The heart learns safety. God heals fear of giving. Love flows again without loss. Peace protects generosity. Balance remains. Healing restores healthy openness. God strengthens the heart. Love becomes stable. Joy follows. Pain can distort trust in authority. People struggle with guidance. God restores trust carefully. God distinguishes human failure from divine faithfulness. Healing corrects perception. Trust rebuilds wisely. God teaches discernment through experience. Healing strengthens judgment. Confidence returns slowly. Trust becomes balanced. God restores clarity. Fear fades. Peace grows. Some wounds affect emotional reactions. Small things trigger big responses. God calms sensitivity. Healing regulates emotions. God restores control. Reactions soften. Peace increases. God teaches patience through healing. Emotional stability strengthens. Calm becomes natural. Healing brings emotional balance. God restores composure. Confidence grows. Freedom returns. Pain can create spiritual impatience. People want quick relief. God values completeness over speed. Healing teaches endurance. God strengthens patience. Trust deepens through waiting. Peace grows. God works thoroughly. Healing closes every wound. Nothing is rushed. Stability forms. Patience produces strength. God restores peace fully. Healing lasts. Confidence remains. Unhealed pain affects decision confidence. Doubt grows quietly. God restores assurance. Healing clarifies judgment. God rebuilds trust in choices. Confidence returns gently. God guides healed hearts clearly. Peace confirms direction. Fear releases control. Confidence stabilizes. God restores inner assurance. Decisions feel safe. Peace remains. Pain can limit emotional expression. People hold back. God restores healthy expression. Healing removes fear of emotion. God balances honesty with wisdom. Expression becomes safe. God teaches healthy communication. Healing frees expression. Peace follows. Emotional freedom returns. God restores openness. Joy grows. Stability remains. Some hurt affects spiritual confidence. People feel unworthy. God restores assurance. Healing replaces guilt with grace. God restores confidence in faith. Peace returns. God reaffirms belonging. Healing strengthens identity. Confidence grows. Spiritual security returns. God restores peace. Faith stabilizes. Pain can cause emotional withdrawal from joy. Laughter feels distant. God restores joy gently. Healing reintroduces joy slowly. God removes fear of happiness. Balance returns. God heals joy without guilt. Peace accompanies happiness. Confidence grows. Joy becomes natural again. God restores emotional fullness. Freedom remains. Some wounds affect trust in oneself. Doubt replaces confidence. God restores inner trust. Healing strengthens self-belief. God renews assurance. Confidence returns gradually. God teaches reliance without fear. Healing stabilizes confidence. Peace grows. Self-trust returns. God restores clarity. Freedom follows. Pain can affect emotional patience. People feel irritable. God restores calm. Healing softens emotional edges. God brings gentleness. Reactions improve. God renews patience through peace. Healing steadies the heart. Calm returns. Patience becomes natural. God restores balance. Stability grows. Hurt can distort expectations. People expect pain. God restores hope. Healing rewires expectation. God teaches trust again. Fear fades. God rebuilds optimism. Healing strengthens outlook. Peace returns. Expectation becomes healthy. God restores hope. Joy grows. Some pain affects emotional availability. People disconnect. God restores presence. Healing reconnects the heart. God restores engagement. Balance returns. God heals avoidance patterns. Presence strengthens. Peace grows. Emotional availability returns. God restores connection. Stability remains. Pain can affect gratitude. Focus shifts to loss. God restores perspective. Healing renews appreciation. God highlights blessings. Peace grows. God restores thankful hearts. Healing balances focus. Joy returns. Gratitude deepens. God restores contentment. Peace remains. Unhealed hurt affects trust in love. Fear replaces openness. God restores security. Healing rebuilds trust slowly. God protects the heart. Balance returns. God heals fear of love. Openness grows safely. Peace increases. Love becomes safe again. God restores confidence. Freedom remains. Pain can create emotional heaviness. Joy feels forced. God restores lightness. Healing lifts emotional weight. God renews joy naturally. Peace returns. God replaces heaviness with calm. Healing refreshes the soul. Balance grows. Lightness returns. God restores emotional freedom. Joy flows. Some wounds affect spiritual motivation. Desire fades. God restores passion. Healing reignites purpose. God renews desire. Faith strengthens. God restores spiritual hunger. Healing deepens commitment. Peace grows. Motivation returns. God restores passion. Stability remains. Pain can cause emotional mistrust. Suspicion grows. God restores discernment. Healing replaces suspicion with wisdom. God protects peace. Balance returns. God teaches trust without naivety. Healing strengthens judgment. Calm grows. Discernment stabilizes. God restores peace. Confidence remains. Unhealed hurt affects emotional generosity. People hold back kindness. God restores balance. Healing renews compassion. God protects the heart. Love flows wisely. God restores giving without loss. Healing strengthens boundaries. Peace grows. Generosity returns. God restores balance. Joy remains. Pain can affect faith consistency. Emotions fluctuate. God restores steadiness. Healing stabilizes faith. God renews trust. Peace returns. God strengthens spiritual grounding. Healing deepens roots. Confidence grows. Faith becomes steady. God restores assurance. Stability remains. Some pain affects emotional confidence in public. People withdraw. God restores courage. Healing rebuilds confidence. God removes fear. Strength returns. God restores boldness gently. Healing stabilizes confidence. Peace grows. Courage returns. God restores presence. Freedom remains. Pain can distort perception of God's character. Doubt arises. God restores truth. Healing corrects misunderstanding. God reveals faithfulness. Peace returns. God rebuilds trust in his nature. Healing strengthens faith. Calm grows. Understanding deepens. God restores clarity. Confidence remains. Unhealed wounds affect emotional security. Fear dominates. God restores safety. Healing builds emotional security. God protects the heart. Peace grows. God restores inner safety. Healing stabilizes emotions. Confidence returns. Security deepens. God restores calm. Freedom remains. Pain can create emotional hesitation. People delay action. God restores confidence. Healing renews decisiveness. God removes fear. Peace returns. God strengthens trust in timing. Healing stabilizes action. Calm grows. Movement resumes. God restores assurance. Stability remains. Hurt can affect long-term emotional vision. Life feels limited. God restores expansion. Healing broadens perspective. God renews hope. Peace returns. God restores vision for growth. Healing strengthens expectation. Joy grows. The heart expands again. God restores freedom. Healing prepares the way forward. Hurt from others can create a sense of helplessness. People feel trapped in emotions they cannot control. Even daily routines feel overwhelming. God sees every struggle of the heart and invites his presence into the chaos. Emotional helplessness often leads to indecision. Choices feel heavy and the mind searches endlessly for solutions. God offers wisdom in quiet moments. He teaches that surrendering to him does not mean giving up, but trusting his guidance. Healing begins when the heart releases the need for control. God restores peace by reminding us that he is always working behind the scenes. The weight of unresolved emotions begins to lift as faith grows. Gradually, the heart regains stability. Confidence in decision-making returns, and the sense of being trapped diminishes. God turns the helplessness into strength, showing that even through pain, he is guiding every step. Some wounds make people question their value. Hurtful words echo repeatedly, and self-worth seems fragile. God understands the inner struggle of feeling unworthy, and he speaks truth to those hearts. When self-doubt dominates, it can impact every aspect of life. Relationships, work, and spiritual practices may suffer. God reminds us that identity is not determined by others' actions, but by his love. Healing begins when we accept this truth. God replaces self-criticism with affirmations of worth. He encourages the wounded heart to rest in his perspective rather than the world's opinion. Emotional scars slowly lose their power over our minds. As healing grows, confidence blossoms. The heart stands firm, knowing that God sees value where humans fail to recognize it. Self-assurance returns, grounded in divine truth rather than human validation. Pain can isolate a person. Hurtful experiences create a wall separating individuals from friends, family, and even God. Loneliness feels heavy and endless. God reaches into this isolation, inviting his presence to be a companion in solitude. Isolation often deepens fear and anxiety. The heart begins to doubt its ability to connect again. God gently reminds that true connection begins with him, and his love fills the void left by broken human relationships. Healing restores the ability to engage without fear. Walls built from pain begin to crumble as trust in God's protection strengthens. The heart becomes courageous, ready to interact with others wisely. With time, emotional connection flourishes. God teaches discernment and opens doors to safe relationships. Isolation transforms into purposeful solitude and relational balance. Sometimes pain makes people suspicious of everyone's intentions. Every action seems like a potential threat. God notices this mistrust and gently calls hearts back to discernment rather than paranoia. Suspicion keeps the heart closed, cutting off love and joy. God teaches patience in understanding human nature, showing that trust can be rebuilt slowly without sacrificing safety. Healing involves relearning faith in others while maintaining boundaries. God restores confidence in healthy connections while protecting the heart from repeated harm. Over time, the heart learns balance. Trust and caution coexist. God transforms suspicion into wisdom, creating both emotional safety and openness to relationships. Emotional pain can leave lingering bitterness. People replay wrongs, growing resentment in their hearts. God sees the burden and calls for release, teaching that bitterness only prolongs suffering. Bitterness consumes energy and clouds judgment. It interferes with spiritual growth, prayer, and emotional well-being. God invites the wounded to surrender resentment, trusting him to enact justice. Healing comes through forgiveness, not for the offender's sake, but for the freedom of the wounded heart. Letting go lifts emotional weight and restores peace. Gradually, the bitterness fades. God replaces resentment with calm, perspective, and understanding. The heart feels lighter and ready to embrace life again. Pain can make someone feel invisible. Being hurt often silences voices and hides emotions. God sees those hidden tears, acknowledging the suffering the world ignores. Feeling invisible can harm confidence and spiritual vitality. The heart questions purpose and presence. God reminds that each life matters profoundly and nothing is unseen by him. Healing begins when the individual accepts God's acknowledgement of their worth. The heart learns that validation starts with God, not humans. This spiritual recognition restores emotional balance. As confidence grows, the sense of invisibility disappears. God restores visibility in relationships, purpose, and prayer. The heart feels valued, seen, and secure. Sometimes emotional wounds make people defensive. Every comment or action feels like an attack. God observes this defensive posture and teaches patience. Defensiveness often damages relationships, even unintentionally. God's wisdom instructs on how to respond calmly, protecting the heart without building walls that block love. Healing reshapes the response. God softens reactions, helping the wounded heart respond with thoughtfulness instead of immediate judgment. Emotional control replaces impulsiveness. With time, relationships improve. The heart becomes secure, measured, and peaceful. God transforms defensiveness into emotional resilience and wisdom. Pain can create fear of failure. Past hurt convinces the heart to avoid risks or trust. God reminds that failure is not permanent and that his grace is sufficient. Fear limits growth and suppresses potential. God teaches that even through mistakes, the heart can heal and learn. Courage and wisdom emerge when reliance is placed on him. Healing begins as faith overcomes fear. The heart learns to trust God's timing and direction, taking steps with confidence rather than hesitation. Over time, fear loses authority. God restores boldness, enabling growth in personal, spiritual, and relational areas. The heart becomes courageous and purposeful. Unhealed emotional pain can create a constant need for approval. People seek validation to feel safe, missing the inner security God offers. Seeking approval often leads to disappointment. God teaches that true confidence and worth come from Him, not human praise. Healing redirects the heart to His affirmation. God restores self-assurance. Trusting Him replaces the need for constant approval. The heart gains freedom, stability, and internal peace. Gradually, independence grows. God's validation becomes sufficient. Confidence rises naturally. The heart rests in divine acknowledgement rather than human judgment. Some wounds make people reluctant to love fully. Fear of hurt repeats itself in every relationship. God sees the hesitation and calls the heart to trust Him. Avoiding love creates loneliness and blocks joy. God's love models trust and safety. Healing involves understanding that God protects while encouraging openness. Healing gradually restores emotional courage. Trust grows as the heart experiences safety under God's care. Boundaries exist without shutting out love. As trust returns, relationships flourish. God restores the ability to love wisely and safely. Emotional joy deepens, replacing fear. Pain can make people overly critical of themselves and others. The heart develops unrealistic standards to avoid further hurt. God teaches balance through compassion. Self-criticism drains energy and blocks growth. God invites the wounded to accept imperfection and rely on His guidance. Healing begins when grace replaces harsh judgment. God reshapes perceptions. Compassion softens expectations and fosters patience. The heart learns to extend grace to self and others. Healing brings emotional balance. God restores understanding and gentleness. Relationships improve, and confidence grows steadily. Hurt can foster resentment toward God. People feel misunderstood or abandoned. God is aware of these struggles and welcomes honest dialogue. Spiritual doubt often accompanies emotional pain. God does not reject the seeker. He offers presence and guidance. Healing begins with acknowledgement of feelings and openness to His comfort. God restores faith through patient reassurance. The heart learns that pain is temporary, purpose is eternal, and His love is unwavering. As trust returns, spiritual connection deepens. Emotional wounds heal alongside faith. God restores confidence in His plan and character. Some wounds make people dwell on past mistakes, blaming themselves endlessly. God gently reminds the heart that healing starts with release. Self-blame prolongs suffering and obscures growth. God offers forgiveness, understanding, and freedom from guilt. Healing involves letting go of what cannot be changed. God restores perspective and encourages forward movement. The heart sees mistakes as lessons, not defining moments. Emotional clarity emerges. With time, guilt fades. God replaces regret with peace. Confidence grows. The heart moves forward, ready to embrace life fully. Pain can distort how people interpret interactions. Neutral words feel like attacks. God offers clarity and emotional stability. Misinterpretation strains relationships and feeds unnecessary fear. God teaches discernment to differentiate harmless actions from harmful intent. Healing restores balance. The heart learns to respond thoughtfully rather than react impulsively. Emotional intelligence grows. Peace replaces constant tension. As clarity develops, interactions improve. God restores confidence in interpreting human behavior. Emotional security strengthens. Hurt often leads to comparison with others' lives. People wonder why they suffer while others succeed. God reminds hearts that each journey is unique. Comparison breeds envy and dissatisfaction. Healing begins when the heart trusts God's timing and plan. Individual growth is valued over external standards. God restores contentment and focus. The heart appreciates blessings without distraction from others' progress. Emotional freedom increases. Peace replaces comparison. God restores joy and gratitude. Life is lived fully, anchored in trust rather than judgment. Pain sometimes generates anger that lingers silently. The heart simmers with unexpressed emotions. God sees this hidden struggle and invites release. Silent anger corrodes joy and relationships. God encourages surrendering anger to Him, trusting His justice. Healing begins when resentment is offered to God. As the heart releases anger, emotional weight decreases. God brings calm understanding and perspective. Peace becomes natural. Eventually, anger dissolves. God restores patience, composure, and relational harmony. The heart thrives free from internal fire. Some emotional wounds make people hesitant to trust God's promises. Fear overshadows hope. God reassures that His words are reliable and true. Doubt creates spiritual tension and uncertainty. Healing begins when faith outweighs fear. God restores trust in His guidance and provision. God strengthens hope. As emotional wounds heal, the heart learns patience and confidence in divine timing. Joy returns naturally. Faith stabilizes. God restores trust and expectation. Emotional clarity strengthens. The heart looks forward with certainty. Pain can make people reactive in relationships. Small disagreements escalate unnecessarily. God offers the heart wisdom and patience. Overreaction damages connections. Healing involves emotional regulation and discernment. God guides the heart to respond thoughtfully rather than impulsively. As control returns, the heart experiences calm. Communication becomes effective. Emotional balance is restored. Reactions are measured. God restores harmony in relationships. Peace replaces tension. Emotional strength grows. Some wounds foster perfectionism. People attempt to control outcomes to prevent hurt. God teaches balance and grace. Perfectionism drains energy and causes unnecessary stress. Healing begins when the heart surrenders control to God. Faith, not force, guides actions. God restores confidence in doing well without needing perfection. Boundaries, patience, and wisdom replace obsession. Freedom grows. God restores emotional balance and contentment. The heart thrives without pressure. Pain can lead to fear of change. People avoid decisions, fearing hurt will repeat. God reassures hearts that growth requires trust. Fear blocks progress and diminishes hope. Healing starts when faith in God's plan outweighs fear. Courage emerges gradually. God restores willingness to move forward. The heart learns resilience. Challenges become opportunities rather than threats. Change becomes approachable. God strengthens trust, ensuring the heart embraces growth with peace. Confidence returns fully. Hurt often leaves hearts hesitant to trust again. The memory of betrayal can make people cautious and withdrawn. God sees the hesitation and gently calls the heart toward trust once more. Fear of repeating mistakes can dominate emotions. God teaches that past pain does not dictate the future. Healing begins when faith outweighs fear and reliance shifts from human expectation to divine wisdom. As trust is restored, the heart learns discernment. God strengthens intuition, allowing relationships to be approached with clarity, confidence, and peace. Emotional safety becomes possible. Gradually, courage blooms. God restores the ability to trust without naivety. The heart moves forward with wisdom, experiencing healthy connections and relational freedom. Emotional pain often creates overthinking. Small actions are interpreted as large offenses. God calls for stillness, teaching that clarity is more powerful than reaction. Overthinking can trap the mind in cycles of doubt and fear. Healing begins when the heart submits to God's perspective, allowing thoughts to align with truth rather than assumptions. God restores peace to restless minds. Insight replaces confusion. And the heart learns to respond thoughtfully instead of impulsively. Emotional clarity grows naturally. With time, overthinking diminishes. God strengthens decision-making and inner calm. The heart navigates life confidently, free from mental chaos and unnecessary worry. Some pain manifests as jealousy or comparison. Watching others' success can stir insecurity. God reminds hearts that every journey is unique and purposeful. Comparison robs joy and increases emotional weight. Healing begins when the heart trusts God's timing and appreciates individual progress. Contentment replaces envy. God nurtures gratitude and perspective. He restores focus to blessings rather than deficiencies. Emotional freedom returns as the heart aligns with divine purpose. With practice, comparison loses power. God restores inner peace and joy. The heart flourishes without distraction, fully embracing life's unique path. Hurt can lead to emotional withdrawal. People isolate to protect themselves. God gently calls hearts back into connection and vulnerability. Isolation might feel safe, but ultimately prolongs loneliness and sorrow. Healing begins when the heart allows God's presence to fill the void, teaching trust in His protection. God restores courage to engage safely with others. Emotional walls crumble, and relationships can flourish without fear of pain repeating. Boundaries coexist with openness. Over time, withdrawal transforms into balance. God strengthens relational confidence. The heart experiences connection, joy, and security simultaneously. Some wounds distort perception of self-worth. Hurtful words echo repeatedly, convincing hearts they are not enough. God speaks affirmation into the soul. Self-doubt can impact every area of life. Healing begins when the heart internalizes God's perspective of value, replacing external judgment with divine truth. God restores confidence gradually. Emotional wounds soften as the heart learns to trust in inherent worth and identity rooted in Him. As healing solidifies, self-assurance grows naturally. God strengthens the heart's sense of purpose, and the inner voice shifts from criticism to affirmation. Pain often generates anger that silently simmers. The heart becomes tense, waiting for release. God calls for surrender, teaching that freedom comes through letting go. Silently holding on to anger damages joy and relationships. Healing begins when resentment is entrusted to God. Trusting His justice and timing, God softens the heart, replacing bitterness with calm understanding. Emotional balance returns as forgiveness flows from faith rather than obligation. With time, anger dissolves. God restores peace, patience, and relational harmony. Emotional freedom blooms, allowing the heart to thrive. Some emotional wounds create spiritual fatigue. Prayer feels heavy, connection feels distant, and faith seems difficult to sustain. God understands this exhaustion. Spiritual fatigue is natural when the heart carries unresolved pain. Healing begins when hearts lean into God's presence, even in silence, trusting He is restoring strength internally. God rejuvenates the soul, reminding hearts of His presence and purpose. Energy for worship, prayer, and obedience returns gradually as the heart heals. Eventually, spiritual vitality grows. God restores clarity, connection, and joy in faith. The heart is renewed, ready to pursue His will with enthusiasm. Pain can make people overly cautious, avoiding risks to prevent further hurt. God invites hearts to balance caution with courage. Excessive fear limits growth. Healing begins when the heart surrenders to God's guidance, trusting Him to protect while encouraging forward movement. God restores boldness and discernment. Emotional wounds are acknowledged, but no longer dictate action. Confidence and resilience develop. Over time, caution transforms into wisdom. God strengthens the heart, allowing calculated risks and healthy growth without fear. Unhealed hurt can make people emotionally reactive. Small issues provoke strong responses. God teaches calmness and measured reactions. Reactivity harms relationships and clouds judgment. Healing begins when the heart surrenders control to God, learning to respond rather than react. God restores emotional regulation, patience, understanding, and perspective. Replace impulsive actions. Peace becomes the default emotional state. With practice, the heart stabilizes. God strengthens self-control. Interactions improve, and emotional resilience becomes permanent. Pain sometimes fosters perfectionism. People attempt to control outcomes to prevent failure. God teaches grace and balance. Perfectionism creates stress and emotional tension. Healing begins when the heart trusts God's timing and guidance instead of trying to control everything. God restores acceptance of imperfection. Boundaries, patience, and wisdom replace obsessive behavior. Confidence grows naturally. Freedom emerges. God restores joy, emotional stability, and peace. The heart learns to thrive without unnecessary pressure. Some wounds affect relationships with authority figures. Doubt and fear replace trust. God restores discernment and confidence. Mistrust can limit growth and opportunities. Healing begins when hearts surrender fears to God, seeking guidance through His wisdom rather than human expectation. God rebuilds the ability to follow guidance without fear. Trust and understanding replace skepticism and tension. Emotional balance strengthens. Authority relationships improve. God restores clarity and peace. The heart engages with confidence, maintaining both discernment and respect. Pain often brings over cautiousness in love. Hearts avoid vulnerability to prevent hurt. God gently invites emotional courage. Avoidance blocks joy and intimacy. Healing begins when the heart relies on God's protection rather than self-preservation. God restores openness to healthy love. Boundaries remain intact, while trust grows naturally. Emotional courage develops gradually. As vulnerability returns, relationships flourish. God restores joy, intimacy, and confidence in connection without fear. Hurt can lead to self-isolation, creating a disconnect from both people and God. Solitude feels safe, but extends loneliness. God calls hearts to embrace connection. Isolation feeds sadness and doubt. Healing begins when God fills the void, teaching trust in His presence and timing. God rebuilds relational confidence. The heart learns to connect safely, combining discernment with openness. Emotional walls soften. Gradually, the heart experiences balance. God restores healthy relationships and internal peace. Connection brings joy without risk of repeated pain. Pain can distort self-perception. People feel inadequate or flawed. God restores truth and identity. Negative self-beliefs harm confidence and emotional stability. Healing begins when the heart trusts God's definition of worth rather than external judgment. God rebuilds self-assurance. Emotional wounds lose power. The heart recognizes value and purpose rooted in divine affirmation. As healing solidifies, confidence grows naturally. God restores emotional stability, identity, and clarity, strengthening resilience. Some wounds make the heart cynical toward life. Expectation diminishes, and hope seems fragile. God restores optimism and perspective. Cynicism blocks joy and emotional growth. Healing begins when the heart surrenders negativity to God, trusting His promises and timing. God rebuilds hope and restores vision for the future. Emotional clarity and spiritual focus replace doubt and skepticism. Over time, hope strengthens. God restores faith in life's goodness. The heart thrives with renewed joy, expectation, and resilience. Pain can create chronic stress in relationships. Oversensitivity leads to misunderstandings and conflict. God restores calm and wisdom. Stress impacts communication and emotional stability. Healing begins when hearts surrender fears and anxieties to God's care. God restores patience and understanding. Emotional regulation replaces reactive tension. Relationships stabilize as the heart grows resilient. With continued guidance, peace becomes consistent. God restores harmony, confidence, and trust, allowing the heart to thrive relationally. Unhealed wounds may cause fear of rejection. People withdraw to protect themselves. God restores relational confidence. Fear of rejection limits emotional expression and connection. Healing begins when the heart trusts God's protection and guidance. God strengthens discernment, allowing safe engagement with others. Emotional courage replaces hesitation and retreat. The heart grows open without vulnerability to harm. God restores relational confidence, joy, and the freedom to love safely. Pain often leads to excessive self-blame. People replay mistakes endlessly. God restores forgiveness and perspective. Self-blame diminishes confidence and joy. Healing begins when hearts release guilt to God, recognizing that mistakes are lessons, not identity. God restores understanding and perspective. Emotional freedom grows as the heart learns to trust divine guidance. Confidence returns naturally. God restores clarity, hope, and peace. The heart moves forward empowered. Some wounds foster anger towards circumstances or people. Silent resentment weighs heavily. God teaches surrender for freedom. Resentment drains joy and blocks emotional healing. Healing begins when hearts release bitterness to God, trusting His timing. God softens anger and restores emotional balance. The heart learns patience and understanding, allowing peace to grow. Gradually, anger dissolves. God restores composure, joy, and relational harmony. Emotional freedom emerges fully. Hurt can affect decision-making confidence. Fear of mistakes prevents action. God restores courage and clarity. Fear undermines potential and slows progress. Healing begins when hearts rely on God's wisdom, trusting His guidance over human doubts. God restores decisiveness and trust in judgment. Emotional wounds no longer dominate choices. Peace replaces hesitation. Confidence strengthens. God restores clarity, courage, and emotional security. The heart navigates life wisely and freely. Some pain leads to spiritual doubt. People question God's care and plan. Healing restores trust and faith. Doubt weakens joy and hope. Healing begins when the heart surrenders fears and seeks God's perspective. God restores assurance and divine guidance. Emotional and spiritual clarity emerge together. The heart trusts His character fully. Faith stabilizes. God restores confidence, joy, and emotional resilience. Hope rises stronger than before. Pain can make people defensive in conversation. Words feel like attacks. God restores patience and understanding. Defensiveness damages relationships. Healing begins when hearts surrender fear and adopt grace-filled discernment. God restores thoughtful responses. Emotional control replaces impulsive reactions. Peace grows naturally. Interactions improve. God restores harmony, emotional strength, and relational confidence. Unhealed hurt can make people avoid vulnerability. Trusting others feels risky. God restores courage and emotional openness. Avoidance blocks connection and joy. Healing begins when hearts rely on God's protection, learning discernment with confidence. God restores willingness to engage safely. Boundaries remain intact while openness grows naturally. Vulnerability returns. God strengthens relational trust, joy, and the heart's resilience. Pain can distort perception of future opportunities. Hope diminishes and expectation feels limited. God restores vision and optimism. Doubt clouds judgment and decision-making. Healing begins when the heart relies on God's promises and timing. God restores confidence in the journey ahead. Emotional clarity replaces hesitation and fear. Hope strengthens naturally. The heart embraces the future. God restores courage, joy, and trust. life feels abundant and secure. Some wounds foster emotional rigidity. People resist change or new experiences. God restores flexibility and resilience. Rigidity limits growth and joy. Healing begins when hearts surrender fear of uncertainty to God's care. God restores openness, adaptability, and emotional freedom. The heart learns to navigate life confidently. Gradually, resilience grows. God restores peace, confidence, and courage. Emotional flexibility becomes permanent. Pain can make hearts overly cautious in decision-making. Even small choices feel risky, and doubt dominates. God gently reminds that guidance comes from Him, not fear. Excessive caution blocks opportunities and growth. Healing begins when the heart trusts God's wisdom to direct steps safely. God restores confidence in choices. Emotional wounds lose control as discernment replaces hesitation. Clarity and courage emerge naturally. The heart moves forward with assurance. God strengthens decision-making, allowing bold yet careful action without fear. Some wounds make people reluctant to forgive. Grudges linger, creating bitterness. God calls hearts toward release and freedom. Holding on to hurt prolongs pain and blocks spiritual growth. Healing begins when the heart surrenders resentment to God. God restores the ability to forgive without compromising boundaries. Peace replaces anger, and emotional balance returns. Gradually, the heart experiences joy again. God transforms bitterness into understanding, restoring relational and emotional freedom. Pain can cause emotional withdrawal. People hide feelings to avoid further hurt. God invites hearts back into vulnerability with protection. Withdrawal leads to loneliness and missed opportunities for connection. Healing begins as hearts accept God's care in safe relational spaces. God restores courage to express emotions thoughtfully. Walls built from fear soften, and relational engagement becomes healthy. Over time, withdrawal turns into balance. God strengthens trust, openness, and relational confidence while maintaining wisdom. Some wounds distort self-image. Past hurts convince hearts they are unworthy. God restores true identity and value. Low self-esteem impacts confidence and emotional health. Healing begins when hearts internalize God's perspective on worth and purpose. God rebuilds self-assurance. Emotional scars soften, allowing confidence and authenticity to emerge naturally. The heart embraces truth. God restores emotional stability, resilience, and inner clarity rooted in His love. Pain can generate internalized anger. Silent resentment builds tension and irritability. God teaches the power of release. Anger kept inside damages the heart and relationships. Healing begins when the heart surrenders resentment to God's justice. God restores calm, patience, and understanding. Emotional balance replaces tension, creating relational harmony. Bitterness fades gradually. God strengthens composure and peace. The heart thrives free from internal conflict. Some wounds lead to fear of emotional vulnerability. People avoid intimacy to prevent hurt. God restores courage. Fear blocks meaningful relationships and joy. Healing begins when hearts trust God's protection and timing for safe connection. God rebuilds openness and relational discernment. Emotional courage grows alongside healthy boundaries. The heart experiences safe vulnerability. God restores trust, emotional freedom, and the ability to connect deeply. Pain can make hearts dwell on past mistakes. Guilt and regret dominate daily thoughts. God calls hearts toward forgiveness and perspective. Over-focusing on mistakes limits growth and joy. Healing begins when the heart surrenders guilt to God and trusts His grace. God restores understanding and emotional freedom. Lessons replace shame, and confidence gradually returns. The heart moves forward with assurance. God restores clarity, hope, and resilience for future growth. Unhealed pain can distort trust in others. Suspicion dominates interactions, creating emotional distance. God restores discernment. Distrust isolates hearts and blocks meaningful relationships. Healing begins when the heart relies on God's guidance and protection. God rebuilds confidence in discernment and relational safety. Emotional wounds lose control, replaced by calm and understanding. The heart navigates connections with wisdom. God restores relational courage, trust, and peace. Pain sometimes causes hesitation in pursuing dreams. Fear of failure or rejection holds people back. God restores boldness. Hesitation limits growth and fulfillment. Healing begins when the heart trusts God's timing and direction, releasing fear. God strengthens confidence and clarity in pursuing goals. Emotional scars lose influence over decisions. Boldness and determination return. God restores vision, courage, and faith in purpose. Some wounds create spiritual doubt. People question God's faithfulness after pain. God restores trust and confidence. Doubt diminishes hope and emotional stability. Healing begins when hearts surrender fears and lean on God's promises. God rebuilds faith and perspective. Emotional and spiritual wounds heal together as trust strengthens. Confidence grows naturally. God restores hope, faith, and the ability to embrace life's challenges with assurance. Pain can make people reactive in conversations. Minor disagreements trigger strong emotions. God restores patience. Reactivity strains relationships and increases stress. Healing begins when the heart surrenders fears and learns grace-filled discernment. God restores thoughtful responses. Emotional regulation replaces impulsive reactions, fostering stability. Interactions improve gradually. God restores harmony, emotional strength, and relational trust. Some wounds create a fear of taking risks. Past failures discourage forward movement. God restores courage and resilience. Fear blocks progress and potential. Healing begins when the heart relies on God's wisdom and protection. God restores boldness, balanced with discernment. Emotional wounds lose authority over action. Confidence and courage return. God strengthens the heart to pursue opportunities and embrace growth safely. Unhealed hurt can distort perception of others' intentions. Innocuous actions are misread. God restores clarity and discernment. Mistrust damages relationships and heightens anxiety. Healing begins when hearts trust God's guidance rather than assumptions. God rebuilds relational insight. Emotional wounds are replaced by wisdom, patience, and understanding. Clarity strengthens. God restores confidence in interpreting human behavior and maintaining healthy boundaries. Pain can cause perfectionism. Hearts demand control over outcomes to prevent hurt. God restores grace and balance. Perfectionism breeds stress and fear of failure. Healing begins when hearts surrender outcomes to God's guidance. God restores acceptance and emotional peace. Boundaries, patience, and wisdom replace obsessive control. The heart thrives. God restores joy, emotional stability, and freedom to live without unrealistic pressure. Some wounds affect emotional consistency. People oscillate between extremes. God restores steadiness and composure. Emotional instability affects relationships and mental health. Healing begins when the heart releases control to God and relies on His guidance. God restores balance and perspective. Emotional responses become measured, stable, and resilient. Steadiness returns. God strengthens composure, emotional maturity, and relational confidence. Pain can generate cynicism toward life. Hope seems fragile and expectation limited. God restores optimism. Cynicism blocks joy and growth. Healing begins when the heart trusts God's plan and releases disappointment. God restores perspective and faith in purpose. Emotional freedom replaces doubt and skepticism. Hope strengthens. God restores confidence, joy, and trust. The heart flourishes with renewed perspective. Some wounds foster avoidance of intimacy. Fear dominates emotional engagement. God restores relational courage. Avoidance leads to loneliness and missed opportunities for connection. Healing begins when hearts rely on God's protection and timing. God rebuilds trust and emotional openness. Boundaries coexist with vulnerability, creating safe engagement. The heart embraces relational confidence. God restores joy, trust, and meaningful connection. Pain often fosters self-criticism. People blame themselves excessively. God restores perspective and self-worth. Excessive self-blame diminishes confidence and joy. Healing begins when hearts release guilt and accept God's grace. God restores clarity and emotional freedom. Lessons replace shame, empowering the heart to move forward. Self-confidence grows. God restores resilience, hope, and peace for a future rooted in trust and purpose. Some wounds create fear of change. People avoid decisions, fearing repeated hurt. God restores trust and adaptability. Fear limits progress and opportunity. Healing begins when hearts surrender control and trust God's guidance. God restores courage to embrace change. Emotional wounds lose influence, replaced by resilience and discernment. The heart adapts confidently. God restores flexibility, peace, and courage to navigate life's seasons effectively. Pain can distort self-perception. People feel invisible or insignificant. God restores identity and worth. Feeling invisible undermines confidence and relationships. Healing begins when hearts internalize God's perspective on value. God rebuilds assurance and emotional balance. Scars lose power as the heart recognizes inherent worth. Confidence flourishes. God restores self-esteem, resilience, and purpose, allowing the heart to thrive. Some wounds make people overly defensive. Every word feels like criticism. God restores calm and wisdom. Defensiveness strains relationships and creates tension. Healing begins when hearts surrender fear and adopt thoughtful discernment. God restores measured responses. Emotional control replaces impulsivity, allowing relational harmony to grow. Peace strengthens. God restores relational confidence, composure, and emotional maturity. Pain sometimes generates fear or vulnerability. People avoid exposure to protect themselves. God restores courage and trust. Fear isolates hearts, limiting joy and connection. Healing begins when hearts rely on God's protection and guidance. God restores openness balanced with wisdom. Emotional courage returns gradually, allowing safe relational engagement. The heart experiences secure vulnerability. God restores relational trust, freedom, and emotional resilience. Unhealed wounds can distort perception of the future. Hope diminishes and expectation narrows. God restores vision and clarity. Doubt clouds judgment and decision-making. Healing begins when the heart relies on God's promises and guidance. God rebuilds confidence in life's potential. Emotional wounds lose authority, replaced by hope and clarity. The heart embraces opportunities. God restores courage, joy, and faith in a purposeful future. Pain can cause rigidity in emotional response. People resist growth and change. God restores flexibility and resilience. Rigidity limits learning, joy, and adaptation. Healing begins when the heart surrenders fear to God's care. God restores adaptability and emotional freedom. The heart learns to navigate life confidently, embracing growth safely. Resilience strengthens. God restores emotional flexibility, composure, and peace in all circumstances. Some wounds make people hesitant to take initiative. Fear of mistakes dominates. God restores confidence and boldness. Hesitation restricts potential and slows progress. Healing begins when hearts trust God's wisdom and timing. God restores decisiveness and courage. Emotional wounds lose influence, replaced by assurance and clarity. The heart moves forward boldly. God strengthens initiative, confidence, and faith-driven action. Pain can generate internal fear of judgment. People avoid expressing opinions or making choices. God restores security and assurance. Fear of judgment limits growth and relationships. Healing begins when the heart trusts God's validation over human approval. God restores confidence and inner peace. Emotional wounds lose power, replaced by clarity and courage. The heart engages confidently. God restores assurance, trust, and freedom to act authentically. Some wounds foster emotional withdrawal. Hearts retreat to avoid potential hurt. God restores connection and courage. Withdrawal creates loneliness and missed joy. Healing begins when the heart embraces God's presence and guidance. God rebuilds courage and relational confidence. Emotional walls soften, allowing healthy engagement. Connection returns naturally. God restores relational freedom, emotional balance, and trust in safe relationships. Pain sometimes generates self-doubt. Hearts question their value and purpose. God restores confidence and perspective. Self-doubt blocks growth and joy. Healing begins when the heart relies on God's truth rather than human judgment. God rebuilds assurance and clarity. Emotional scars lose influence, replaced by understanding and trust. Confidence strengthens. God restores emotional resilience, identity, and purpose. Some wounds create fear of love. Hearts resist intimacy to prevent pain. God restores relational courage. Avoidance limits joy and connection. Healing begins when the heart trusts God's guidance and protection. God rebuilds willingness to love wisely. Boundaries coexist with openness, creating safe engagement. The heart experiences relational confidence. God restores trust, joy, and emotional freedom. Pain can distort self-perception. People feel inadequate or invisible. God restores identity and value. Feeling insignificant undermines confidence and purpose. Healing begins when hearts internalize God's affirmation. God rebuilds assurance and emotional strength. Scars lose power as the heart recognizes worth and purpose. Confidence and clarity return. God restores self-esteem, resilience, and the courage to pursue life fully. Some wounds create excessive fear of failure. People avoid challenges. God restores courage and faith. Fear limits growth and potential. Healing begins when the heart trusts God's protection and guidance. God restores boldness and resilience. Emotional wounds lose influence, replaced by confidence and clarity. The heart embraces challenges. God restores faith, courage, and purpose-driven action. Pain often generates reactive emotions. Small conflicts provoke strong responses. God restores patience and composure. Reactivity damages relationships and blocks clarity. Healing begins when the heart relies on God's guidance. God restores measured responses. Emotional control replaces impulsivity, fostering relational harmony. Peace strengthens. God restores emotional stability, confidence, and trust in interactions. Some wounds lead to fear of expressing needs. Hearts avoid asking for help to prevent rejection. God restores confidence and assertiveness. Fear of vulnerability blocks support and growth. Healing begins when the heart trusts God's guidance and protection. God rebuilds courage to express needs wisely. Emotional freedom returns alongside discernment. The heart engages confidently. God restores relational trust, emotional balance, and the ability to seek help safely. Unhealed pain can distort perception of life's opportunities. Hope diminishes and expectation narrows. God restores vision and optimism. Doubt limits growth and decision-making. Healing begins when the heart relies on God's promises and guidance. God restores confidence in possibilities. Emotional wounds lose control, replaced by hope, courage, and clarity. The heart embraces potential fully. God restores faith, joy, and resilience, enabling confident pursuit of life's calling. Pain sometimes generates rigidity in relationships. Hearts resist compromise or emotional growth. God restores flexibility and understanding. Rigidity blocks harmony and deep connection. Healing begins when hearts surrender fear and rely on God's wisdom. God restores adaptability, patience, and relational balance. Emotional wounds lose influence, replaced by compassion and discernment. Relationships thrive. God strengthens emotional flexibility, peace, and confidence in navigating relational dynamics wisely. Pain can make people doubt their emotional strength. Minor setbacks feel overwhelming. God reminds the heart that He is the source of resilience and courage. Doubt can paralyze action and cloud judgment. Healing begins when the heart relies on God's presence, trusting that His power is sufficient for every challenge. God restores inner strength gradually. Emotional wounds lose influence as faith grows and confidence is renewed in His guidance. With time, resilience becomes natural. God empowers the heart to face challenges boldly while maintaining peace and clarity in every situation. Some wounds make people dwell on others' betrayal. Trust is difficult to rebuild. God teaches the value of discernment balanced with forgiveness. Dwelling on betrayal can erode relationships and joy. Healing begins when the heart releases resentment and seeks God's wisdom. God restores the ability to trust wisely. Emotional walls soften, allowing healthy relationships without repeating past mistakes. Trust grows gradually. God strengthens the heart to engage courageously and wisely, creating relational peace and emotional freedom. Pain sometimes leads to fear of rejection. Hearts withdraw to protect themselves. God restores courage to embrace relational connection. Fear of rejection blocks intimacy and joy. Healing begins when the heart relies on God's guidance and protection. God rebuilds confidence in approaching relationships. Emotional wounds lose control as trust and discernment develop. The heart reconnects safely. God restores relational trust, freedom, and joy, allowing meaningful engagement with others. Some wounds foster self-doubt and indecision. Every choice feels risky. God restores clarity and confidence in decision-making. Indecision hinders progress and amplifies anxiety. Healing begins when the heart submits choices to God and relies on His guidance. God strengthens discernment and courage. Emotional wounds lose influence, replaced by clarity, wisdom, and faith-driven decisions. Confidence grows naturally. God restores assurance, decisiveness, and peace in navigating life's challenges. Pain can distort perception of personal value. People feel unworthy or invisible. God restores self-esteem and purpose. Low self-worth impacts confidence, relationships, and spiritual growth. Healing begins when the heart internalizes God's affirmation of inherent worth. God rebuilds self-assurance. Emotional scars soften as the heart recognizes identity rooted in His love and design. The heart flourishes. God restores confidence, resilience, and clarity, empowering the individual to live purposefully. Hurt can cause emotional defensiveness. Every remark feels threatening. God restores patience and wisdom in responses. Defensiveness strains relationships and increases tension. Healing begins when the heart surrenders fear and adopts God-centered discernment. God restores measured responses. Emotional wounds lose authority, replaced by composure, understanding, and relational harmony. The heart interacts with confidence. God strengthens patience, emotional stability, and trust in all relationships. Pain sometimes makes people avoid vulnerability. Fear dominates emotional engagement. God restores courage to express feelings safely. Avoidance limits connection, joy, and growth. Healing begins when the heart trusts God's protection and guidance in relationships. God rebuilds openness with discernment. Emotional courage returns naturally while maintaining boundaries. The heart experiences safe vulnerability. God restores relational trust, freedom, and emotional resilience. Some wounds create chronic fear of failure. People hesitate to pursue dreams. God restores confidence and boldness. Fear limits potential and achievement. Healing begins when hearts trust God's timing and guidance, releasing anxiety about outcomes. God restores courage and faith in abilities. Emotional wounds lose influence, replaced by clarity, purpose, and determination. The heart embraces opportunities fully. God strengthens boldness, resilience, and confidence in achieving goals. Pain can create overthinking and mental exhaustion. Thoughts spiral into doubt and worry. God restores peace and clarity. Overthinking consumes energy and clouds judgment. Healing begins when the heart relies on God's perspective rather than human assumptions. God restores mental calm. Emotional wounds lose control, replaced by clarity, focus, and thoughtful decision-making. The heart functions with clarity. God strengthens emotional balance, reducing anxiety and restoring inner peace. Some wounds foster resentment toward others. Anger simmers silently, affecting well-being. God teaches the power of release and forgiveness. Resentment blocks joy and spiritual growth. Healing begins when the heart surrenders bitterness to God and trusts His justice. God restores patience, understanding, and peace. Emotional wounds lose control, replaced by calmness and relational harmony. Bitterness fades over time. God strengthens composure, relational confidence, and freedom to thrive emotionally. Pain sometimes causes spiritual fatigue. Prayer feels heavy and connection feels distant. God restores spiritual vitality and hope. Spiritual exhaustion limits growth and joy. Healing begins when the heart leans on God's presence, even in silence. God rebuilds energy and faith. Emotional and spiritual wounds heal together as hope and clarity return. Faith strengthens. God restores connection, purpose, and joy, empowering the heart to embrace life fully. Some wounds make people hesitant to express love or care. Fear of rejection dominates. God restores emotional courage. Avoidance blocks intimacy and relational growth. Healing begins when the heart trusts God's guidance and protection. God rebuilds relational confidence. Emotional courage and discernment allow safe expression of love. Vulnerability returns naturally. God restores relational joy, trust, and deep emotional connection. Pain can distort perception of the future. Hope diminishes and expectation narrows. God restores vision, faith, and clarity. Doubt clouds decision-making and emotional stability. Healing begins when hearts rely on God's promises and timing. God restores confidence and courage. Emotional wounds lose authority, replaced by hope, trust, and perspective. The heart embraces potential fully. God strengthens clarity, faith, and resilience for purposeful living. Some wounds foster self-criticism. People blame themselves for past mistakes. God restores grace and perspective. Self-blame reduces confidence and joy. Healing begins when the heart surrenders guilt to God and embraces His forgiveness. God restores self-acceptance and clarity. Emotional scars lose control, replaced by trust, insight, and resilience. Confidence grows naturally. God strengthens purpose, identity, and emotional freedom, empowering the heart to thrive. Pain sometimes leads to fear of intimacy. Hearts resist vulnerability to avoid hurt. God restores relational trust and courage. Avoidance blocks joy and connection. Healing begins when the heart trusts God's protection and guidance in safe relationships. God rebuilds openness and discernment. Emotional courage grows naturally while boundaries maintain safety. The heart experiences secure connection. God restores trust, emotional freedom, and meaningful engagement. Some wounds create oversensitivity. People misinterpret neutral actions as harmful. God restores clarity and emotional balance. Misinterpretation increases anxiety and damages relationships. Healing begins when the heart relies on God's guidance and perspective. God restores discernment and composure. Emotional wounds lose influence, replaced by patience, clarity, and relational wisdom. The heart navigates interactions confidently. God strengthens trust, peace, and healthy emotional responses. Pain often causes fear of failure. Hesitation dominates, limiting growth. God restores courage and decisiveness. Fear suppresses potential and joy. Healing begins when the heart relies on God's guidance rather than past pain. God restores boldness, insight, and confidence. Emotional wounds lose control, replaced by faith, clarity, and resilience. The heart embraces opportunities fully. God strengthens courage, determination, and confidence to move forward. Some wounds generate internal anger and resentment. Silent frustration damages emotional well-being. God restores peace and understanding. Anger corrodes joy and relationships. Healing begins when the heart surrenders bitterness to God's justice. God softens the heart. Emotional wounds lose power, replaced by patience, calmness, and relational harmony. Bitterness dissolves gradually. God strengthens composure, trust, and emotional resilience for lasting freedom. Pain sometimes fosters fear of change. Hearts resist growth and new opportunities. God restores flexibility and trust. Fear limits growth and experience. Healing begins when the heart surrenders control to God's wisdom and guidance. God restores courage and adaptability. Emotional wounds lose authority, replaced by clarity, insight, and resilience. The heart embraces change confidently. God strengthens faith, flexibility, and peace in navigating life's transitions. Some wounds create a fear of expressing needs. Hearts avoid asking for support. God restores assertiveness and confidence. Fear of rejection limits growth and relational intimacy. Healing begins when the heart trusts God's guidance and protection. God rebuilds courage to express needs wisely. Emotional freedom returns and discernment guides interactions. The heart engages confidently. God restores trust, emotional balance, and the ability to seek help safely. Pain can distort self-perception. People feel inadequate, flawed, or invisible. God restores identity and worth. Low self-worth reduces confidence, joy, and spiritual clarity. Healing begins when the heart internalizes God's affirmation. God rebuilds self-assurance. Emotional wounds lose control as the heart recognizes value rooted in divine design. Confidence grows naturally. God restores resilience, clarity, and emotional strength, empowering the heart to thrive fully. Some wounds foster fear of intimacy. Hearts avoid emotional closeness to prevent hurt. God restores relational courage. Avoidance limits connection, joy, and trust. Healing begins when the heart relies on God's protection and guidance. God rebuilds openness and discernment. Emotional courage grows alongside safe boundaries. The heart reconnects fully. God restores relational trust, joy, and meaningful emotional engagement. Pain sometimes fosters fear of judgment. People hesitate to speak or act. God restores confidence and assurance. Fear suppresses expression and limits growth. Healing begins when the heart relies on God's validation and wisdom. God restores courage and clarity. Emotional wounds lose authority, replaced by insight, trust, and composure. The heart engages confidently. God strengthens freedom, trust, and authentic self-expression. Some wounds create emotional rigidity. People resist new experiences or perspectives. God restores flexibility and resilience. Rigidity limits growth, joy, and adaptation. Healing begins when hearts surrender fear and rely on God's guidance. God restores adaptability and emotional balance. The heart navigates life confidently while embracing growth safely. Resilience strengthens. God restores peace, flexibility, and emotional maturity, allowing the heart to thrive. Pain can cause oversensitivity to criticism. Hearts perceive neutral actions as attacks. God restores discernment and composure. Oversensitivity strains relationships and creates tension. Healing begins when the heart trusts God's perspective rather than fear. God restores patience and understanding. Emotional wounds lose power, replaced by clarity, calm, and relational wisdom. The heart interacts confidently. God strengthens trust, composure, and emotional stability. Some wounds generate fear of failure. People hesitate to pursue opportunities. God restores courage and determination. Fear suppresses potential and achievement. Healing begins when the heart relies on God's guidance rather than past pain. God restores boldness and confidence. Emotional wounds lose influence, replaced by clarity, faith, and resilience. The heart embraces opportunities fully. God strengthens courage, focus, and purposeful action. Pain sometimes fosters internalized anger and resentment. Silent frustration erodes joy. God restores emotional freedom. Anger damages relationships and emotional health. Healing begins when the heart surrenders bitterness to God. God softens the heart. Emotional wounds lose control, replaced by calm, patience, and relational harmony. Freedom returns gradually. God strengthens composure, peace, and emotional resilience for lasting restoration. Some wounds make people hesitant to trust. Fear of betrayal dominates interactions. God restores discernment and faith. Mistrust isolates and blocks meaningful connection. Healing begins when the heart relies on God's guidance and protection. God restores confidence and relational insight. Emotional wounds lose influence, replaced by clarity, patience, and understanding. The heart navigates relationships wisely. God strengthens trust, peace, and relational security. Pain can distort perception of self-worth. People feel inadequate or invisible. God restores confidence and identity. Low self-esteem impacts relationships, spiritual growth, and emotional health. Healing begins when the heart internalizes God's affirmation. God rebuilds self-assurance. Emotional scars lose power, replaced by clarity, trust, and purpose. The heart thrives naturally. God restores emotional strength, resilience, and confidence to embrace life fully. Some wounds create fear of emotional exposure. Hearts avoid vulnerability. God restores courage and openness. Avoidance limits joy, intimacy, and growth. Healing begins when the heart trusts God's protection and guidance. God rebuilds relational courage. Emotional openness grows alongside discernment and safety. The heart reconnects fully. God restores relational trust, joy, and emotional freedom, enabling meaningful and secure connections. Pain can make people feel emotionally fragile. Even small conflicts trigger deep reactions. God restores inner peace and resilience. Fragility can prevent meaningful relationships and cloud judgment. Healing begins when hearts trust God's presence to strengthen and guide them. God rebuilds calmness and emotional stability. Emotional wounds lose control, replaced by patience, insight, and self-assurance. The heart grows resilient. God restores balance, clarity, and confidence to navigate challenges without fear. Some wounds foster self-isolation. Hearts withdraw from support and connection. God restores relational courage and trust. Isolation increases loneliness and emotional strain. Healing begins when the heart relies on God's guidance and protection. God rebuilds confidence in safe engagement. Emotional walls soften as trust and discernment grow. The heart reconnects fully. God restores joy, relational freedom, and emotional resilience. Pain can distort perception of others' intentions. Innocent actions are misinterpreted as threats. God restores clarity and wisdom. Misunderstanding fuels conflict and anxiety. Healing begins when hearts release fear and rely on God's discernment. God restores insight and measured responses. Emotional wounds lose influence, replaced by patience, clarity, and understanding. Interactions improve. God strengthens relational wisdom, composure, and confidence in all communication. Some wounds make people fearful of change. Familiarity feels safe even when it hinders growth. God restores adaptability and courage. Fear limits opportunity and joy. Healing begins when hearts trust God's plan and timing for life's transitions. God rebuilds confidence to embrace new experiences. Emotional wounds lose control, replaced by resilience, insight, and boldness. The heart moves forward with faith. God strengthens flexibility, peace, and confidence in every season. Pain sometimes generates overthinking. Small decisions feel monumental, and worry dominates. God restores clarity and calm. Overthinking drains energy and blocks progress. Healing begins when the heart surrenders doubts and seeks God's perspective. God restores focus and emotional composure. Mental clarity replaces anxiety, enabling wise and confident choices. The heart functions with calm assurance. God strengthens clarity, balance, and faith in decision-making. Some wounds cause fear of intimacy. Hearts avoid closeness to prevent hurt. God restores courage to engage deeply. Avoidance creates emotional distance and loneliness. Healing begins when the heart relies on God's protection and guidance. God rebuilds relational confidence and emotional openness. Boundaries coexist with trust, creating safe connections. The heart reconnects fully. God restores joy, vulnerability, and meaningful engagement. Pain can lead to self-blame. Hearts feel responsible for what others have done. God restores perspective and forgiveness. Excessive guilt damages confidence and emotional health. Healing begins when the heart surrenders blame to God's wisdom and justice. God rebuilds understanding and self-compassion. Emotional wounds lose authority, replaced by clarity, insight, and inner peace. The heart thrives. God strengthens confidence, hope, and resilience for healthy decision-making and relationships. Some wounds make people overly defensive. Every word feels like a threat. God restores composure and discernment. Defensiveness damages communication and relationships. Healing begins when the heart surrenders fear to God and adopts grace-filled understanding. God rebuilds measured responses. Emotional wounds lose control, replaced by calmness, patience, and relational clarity. The heart interacts confidently. God strengthens emotional maturity, relational trust, and inner peace. Pain sometimes fosters cynicism. People doubt intentions and expect betrayal. God restores hope and faith in others. Cynicism blocks trust and relational growth. Healing begins when the heart releases past hurt and relies on God's guidance. God restores discernment and positive expectation. Emotional wounds lose influence, replaced by wisdom, patience, and relational courage. Hope grows. God strengthens trust, emotional freedom, and confidence in relationships. Some wounds make people fear vulnerability. Hearts avoid expressing true emotions. God restores courage to be authentic. Avoidance limits joy, intimacy, and emotional growth. Healing begins when the heart trusts God's protection and guidance. God rebuilds openness and relational courage. Emotional wounds lose power as trust and safety develop. The heart thrives in authenticity. God restores confidence, vulnerability, and meaningful connection. Pain can create fear of failure. Hearts hesitate, limiting growth. God restores boldness and confidence. Fear blocks opportunities and potential. Healing begins when the heart trusts God's timing and wisdom. God rebuilds courage and decisiveness. Emotional wounds lose control, replaced by clarity, purpose, and assurance. The heart embraces opportunities fully. God strengthens resilience, faith, and courage to pursue dreams. Some wounds foster emotional volatility. People swing between extremes. God restores balance and composure. Volatility strains relationships and emotional health. Healing begins when the heart surrenders fear and relies on God's guidance. God restores emotional stability. Extreme reactions soften, replaced by patience, clarity, and measured responses. The heart functions steadily. God strengthens composure, relational wisdom, and confidence. Pain sometimes generates fear of judgment. Hearts avoid sharing opinions or acting boldly. God restores security and self-assurance. Fear suppresses potential and authenticity. Healing begins when the heart relies on God's affirmation and protection. God rebuilds confidence and emotional freedom. Worries about judgment lose influence, replaced by trust, clarity, and boldness. The heart expresses itself courageously. God strengthens authenticity, trust, and emotional resilience. Some wounds create perfectionism. Hearts strive for control to prevent hurt. God restores grace and emotional freedom. Perfectionism creates stress and anxiety. Healing begins when the heart surrenders outcomes to God's guidance. God restores acceptance and balance. Emotional wounds lose authority, replaced by wisdom, patience, and inner peace. The heart thrives. God strengthens composure, resilience, and confidence to live authentically. Pain can distort trust in others. Suspicion dominates interactions. God restores discernment and relational faith. Distrust isolates and limits connection. Healing begins when hearts rely on God's wisdom and protection. God rebuilds confidence in reading people wisely. Emotional wounds lose control, replaced by clarity, patience, and discernment. The heart engages safely. God restores trust, joy, and meaningful connection with others. Some wounds create hesitation in pursuing dreams. Fear of failure dominates. God restores boldness and clarity. Hesitation limits potential and purpose. Healing begins when the heart relies on God's guidance and timing. God rebuilds confidence and determination. Emotional wounds lose influence, replaced by clarity, courage, and focus. The heart moves forward boldly. God strengthens vision, faith, and the ability to pursue life's calling. Pain sometimes fosters resentment. Silent anger corrodes relationships and joy. God restores peace and understanding. Resentment blocks spiritual growth and emotional health. Healing begins when the heart surrenders bitterness to God's justice. God softens the heart. Emotional wounds lose control, replaced by patience, clarity, and relational harmony. The heart experiences freedom. God strengthens composure, trust, and relational wisdom for lasting restoration. Some wounds make people hesitant to engage socially. Fear of hurt dominates interactions. God restores relational courage. Social avoidance increases loneliness and blocks connection. Healing begins when the heart trusts God's protection and timing. God rebuilds confidence in discernment. Emotional wounds lose influence, replaced by clarity, patience, and relational insight. The heart reconnects fully. God restores trust, emotional freedom, and meaningful engagement with others. Pain can distort perception of self-worth. People feel inadequate or undeserving. God restores confidence, value, and identity. Low self-esteem affects relationships, spiritual growth, and emotional health. Healing begins when hearts internalize God's affirmation. God rebuilds self-assurance. Emotional scars lose power, replaced by clarity, courage, and purpose. The heart thrives naturally. God restores resilience, emotional freedom, and confidence to embrace life fully. Some wounds foster fear of emotional exposure. Hearts avoid vulnerability, limiting connection. God restores courage and authenticity. Avoidance blocks intimacy, joy, and growth. Healing begins when the heart relies on God's guidance and protection. God rebuilds openness and relational trust. Emotional courage returns alongside discernment and safety. The heart reconnects fully. God restores emotional freedom, relational confidence, and meaningful engagement. No matter how deeply someone has hurt you, God's wisdom shows us that healing, peace, and freedom are always within reach. Every wound, every betrayal, and every disappointment carries a lesson, but more importantly, carries the opportunity for restoration. The pain you feel does not define your worth, nor does it determine your future. God calls your heart to release bitterness, embrace forgiveness, and step boldly into the life He has designed for you. Forgiveness is not about excusing what was done. It is about freeing your own soul. Each time you let go of resentment, you allow God's peace to flood your heart. Emotional scars begin to soften as trust in Him replaces fear. God's guidance restores clarity in every relationship, and His presence strengthens your courage to love, to connect, and to move forward with hope. Healing transforms more than the wounds of the past. It transforms your present and future. God rebuilds your confidence, restores your emotional balance, and equips you with discernment to navigate life wisely. He turns fear into boldness, doubt into faith, and pain into purpose. Every step toward letting go, every prayer for guidance, and every moment of trust in Him lays the foundation for a life of joy, freedom, and divine peace. Today, you are invited to release what has weighed you down. Release grudges, fear, and self-doubt. Embrace God's promise that no hurt is wasted when surrendered to Him. He restores your strength, renews your hope, and leads you into relationships, opportunities, and experiences that honor your heart. Your past does not control your destiny. God does. Step forward in faith. Trust His timing, and watch as He transforms every hurt into a testimony of His love, grace, and unwavering power.